All right. Good morning. My name is Robert Dillon with ConservAmerica. We are a nonprofit dedicated to promoting market-based solutions to energy and environmental challenges. We've been around a few decades, but have recently reinvigorated ourselves and been working with Congress through the Roosevelt Caucus, Roosevelt Conservation Caucus, and dealing with addressing, the challenges we face both environmentally, energy-wise, and conservation. That's our focus. This morning, we will have we're looking forward to a great conversation on the clean energy standard. Congress has been looking at a couple of pathways to meet President Biden's zero carbon economy goals, and one has been a carbon tax, and the other has been talked about as a clean energy standard. We have a excellent panel with us today to tackle this discussion. We have with us FERC Commissioner Neil Chatterjee, who has a long history of working on energy policy in Congress, working for McConnell of Kentucky. I had the pleasure of working with Neil when I was in the Senate Energy Committee, and so it's good to see you, Neil, this morning.
Thanks for having me.
We also have David Brown, Senior Vice President of Exelon Corporation. David, thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
And Roger Martella, Chief Sustainability Officer for GE, is also here with us today. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
And Peter Kelly Detweiler of Northbridge Energy Partners is here as well. Peter is better known by his initials PKD. He is an energy expert and an analyst, and he's here to tell us what is a CES, the pros and cons, and we'll also be talking about the current state of the policy debate in Congress, because I think people are starting to where obviously this audience knows and the panelists know that a clean energy standard has morphed into a little more of a payment program, subsidy program to meet the requirements of budget reconciliation, which is how Democrats are hoping, Congress is hoping to move this as part of part 2 of the infrastructure package. I also wanted to announce this morning before we get started that we had some good news for one of our ConservAmerica board members. Jim Gottfeldy is a board member, was just named to the Texas PUC. So congratulations to Jim, and we're excited for his success. And that's a big job, right? Lots happening in Texas. Texas is very relevant at the moment. It is the most competitive market we have, but it's also had some problems and pointed out the need for some regulatory changes to protect reliability. So without further ado, Peter, I will turn to you for an introduction on the clean energy standard.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So high level, before we talk about what's actually happening where the sausage is being made, let's just discuss for a minute, what is a clean energy standard? Most of you probably know, but let's just set the rules on that. So it is essentially a rule or a standard mandating that some entity, usually the one serving load. So in competitive markets, it would be the retail suppliers. And then the vertically integrated markets where the utilities still own gen and serve customers, it would be the utilities themselves. And they would then have the responsibility of providing X% of the energy they offer to their customers coming from a specific set of technologies. In this case, zero carbon resources. In the past, we've had state level renewable portfolio standards that have done similar sorts of things, but it depends how you specify what those are. For example, in Maine at one point, it used to involve burning tires. So you really have to be specific about what are the technologies and what are you trying to accomplish, and how you set the rules matters greatly. As I mentioned, we've had these significant precedents at the state level with renewable portfolio standards, RPSs, for decades now. And then we have some states like New York and others that are moving into this clean energy standard. New York, for example, is looking at 70% clean energy by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Typically how these work is you set these level. So the general discussion for the United States right now would be 80% clean energy by 2030 and 100% by 2035. And each entity is responsible for that. And if they don't meet those numbers, they pay some kind of a penalty. It's pretty similar in this, to sort of how a cap and trade works, where non-compliant entities have to pay and there's a floor price set, et cetera. So sounds pretty easy in its general framework, right? Well, maybe not, because again, it depends upon a lot of assumptions. And there are a number of states that have done a lot to move forward with their clean energy goals, and others who haven't, for whom this is going to be a really heavy lift. And a lot of the ones that haven't tend to be pretty coal dependent. And so getting to that 80% by 2030, 100% by 2035, that would require shutting down 185 remaining coal-fired generating plants. And we all know those are very states economy specific. There are a number of states that have the preponderance of those plants. And according to Vox, it would also require shutting down not only existing gas plants, but there are 250 new ones on the books right now that are planning to be built. So it really requires a massive shift to this emerging energy economy, which will not be easy. There's another way that one might do this, which is applying a carbon tax. And some argue that instead of setting these specific targets, say, oh, let the market sort this out. New York ISO, for example, has been looking at this concept for a while and actually has gone in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Commissioner Chatterjee and the group last year said they were actually, at FERC said they were open to this concept. The question there is, how do you price carbon and what's the social cost? And New York right now is in a stage of looking at the social cost of carbon. What's it worth to avoid that ton of carbon or methane equivalent? The real challenge there is you can do that in competitive markets, but then you've got all these vertically integrated utilities in the Southeast and in the Northwest and so on that wouldn't be affected by those competitive markets. And then finally, you get these issues around potentially perverse outcomes. When I was speaking actually to the CEO of New York ISO, he said, one of the concerns we have in looking at a carbon tax is for electricity, okay, now you freight electricity with those costs, you could have the perverse outcome of making electricity more expensive and pushing people onto other fuels. For example, fewer electric vehicles because electricity is more expensive, meaning more people stay with gasoline-powered internal combustion engines. So, yeah.
Peter, you meant a clean energy standard, not a carbon tax, right?
Yeah. Well, either one. If you raise the cost of electricity, which is possible under both scenarios, you could have the perverse outcome of pushing people out of the electric domain into direct consumption of other fuels. So one has to be really thoughtful about what's happening there. The last challenge with the carbon tax is, with a clean energy standard, you get to that 60% or 80% or 100% sort of by fiat, versus a carbon tax where you hope you get there. Oh, if we set this price, are we going to get to this percentage? It's a little bit more derivative in terms of an outcome. So those are the general issues at play here with both of those types of approaches, sort of crudely stated, and obviously the devil's in the details.
So, I think a good summary, a CES is a regulatory approach that guarantees an outcome, but it doesn't guarantee what the cost, or it doesn't, the price of getting there. A more market-based approach, if you're looking at a carbon tax, and we're not trying to compare the two here today, but it's useful just to set up the conversation, is you provide incentives and market signals for people to move in that direction, but the outcome is not guaranteed. But it's more flexible. I think that's a pretty good setup. Thank you. And then, David, David, with Exelon, with nuclear power, there's winners and losers under both of these policies. Focusing on a CES, what's your position on a CES, and where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, so thanks again for the invitation, Robert. It's great to be here with this group today. It's an interesting story. Exelon was actually created 20 years ago with climate change in mind and brought together two of the cleanest fleets in the country. And so now we've got by far the largest generating fleet of carbon-free energy in the US. almost by a factor of 2. And that is largely nuclear, but it also includes hydro and some wind and solar. And then we've got natural gas to round it out. And so we have long supported a price on carbon. And I think that you've seen a real transition in industry lately due to pressure from investors, customers, and even employees. And so we have supported a price on carbon writ large, whether that's a carbon tax. We are a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council, which supports a fee and dividend approach. And that certainly has its advantages. For us, our utilities are in largely urban areas like Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC. And so that rebate dividend component is really essential to keeping our customers insulated from any price increases. A clean energy standard works as well. The primary disadvantage for a clean energy standard is it's not economy-wide. It's a very sector-specific approach. And so, the power sector right now is about a third, slightly less, of carbon emissions nationally. But the reason that you might want to start with the power sector is that it is very responsive to incentives and penalties. And it's also a key to electrifying and decarbonizing other power sectors too. So it really, the bang for the buck in electrifying other sectors comes from having a clean stack to start with. So we are cleaner as an industry than we've been in 40 years. About 40% of the electricity nationally right now is emissions free. And we're obviously adding to that by leaps and bounds on an annual basis. I think that the other big breakthrough that we're seeing that is going to enable a real build out of more intermittent resources is in energy storage, which is an absolute key if we want to maintain a reliable grid as well. So there are a lot of advantages to a CES. Utilities, while we've got long-lived investments, when you build a plant, you usually expect it to run for 40 years or even longer. But we can also be pretty responsive to price signals like you'd get with a CES. So I think there are a lot of advantages to it, but as always, the devil's in the details, and there are any number of factors in here that affect its workability, starting with how far and how fast you go and what the expectations are. And happy to get into that discussion as we continue the dialogue today.
Great, thank you so much. Roger?
Sure. Well, thank you again for including me as well. It's good to see everybody. Honored to be part of this and share our perspective as well, I think, which is pretty consistent with what David said in a large extent. So we all know that the president has proposed a 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. And I think we all recognize, because we're all on this call, that not all sectors are created equal. If that's an average, we know the expectations are some sectors are going to over deliver on that. And clearly the reason we're having this conversation is there's high expectations that the energy sector will over deliver on the 50% reduction. And we understand and support that. The CEPP that's been referenced talks about an 80% reduction by 2030 from the energy sector, I think consistent with President Biden's expectations for that. And I appreciate Peter talking through, an overview of the carbon price, CES, CPP options. It doesn't sound like we're going to talk about cap and trade today, which is fine. But I think at the outset, like David, the details make the difference. We see the potential for a CES or the CPP to be, attractive and interesting in realizing these goals if it's designed in the right way. In terms of our perspective, GE is a company that provides the technology that powers 1/3 of the world's energy. We have a very large renewable energy business. We're the leading provider of onshore wind turbines in the United States. And we also manufacture the largest offshore wind turbine that's built, the Haliade X. We have a strong gas power business, which I'm going to talk about. And we also have a very important grid business, which is focused on the really hard stuff of how you connect renewable energy and variability and make the grid more resilient while at the same time addressing extreme weather events and cybersecurity and digitization and things like that. So we see all three of these businesses, renewables, gas, and grid, as being part of the solution. we have made recently a commitment to be net zero in our scope 3 emissions for our sold products by 2050. And so what that means is, if you think about, we're a renewable energy business, but we're also a gas power business, and we're also a jet engine business and a healthcare business. Our ambition is that we will be net zero by 2050, including the emissions of our sold products. And the way I think about that is it's a commitment by GE to let our customers like Exelon know that we're going to partner with them to make sure they have the technology needed to have this energy transition towards carbon neutrality and help our customers meet their goals. So obviously we believe in resilient, sustainable, and accessible energy. And I think we appreciate, as I said, the potential of a clean energy standard or the CEPP to achieve that if it's designed the correct way. Let me start with renewable energy. Core to all of these discussions is renewable energy. It almost goes without, almost goes unsaid that of course the first thing you have to do is grow as much renewable energy as you can in a reasonable, practical way. One of the things that the Clean Energy Standard does is a lot of the policy that drives renewable energy today is effectively tax policy, investment tax credits, production tax credits, and CEPP, Clean Energy Standard. They create an additional, I think, incentive for renewable energy, additional targets, additional goals that help build on that foundation of existing tax policy. That's a good thing for renewable energy, bringing that additional layer of certainty. I think the questions we have, the two questions I flagged for the discussion are, what does that glide path look like and how can we do it in a resilient way? On the glide path, when we look at, we have some history now with incentives for renewable energy going back, well, a decade. And what we tend to see is when you have a policy or a program like an ITC, PTC, sometimes unintentionally that drives demand more than sometimes. It's pretty well shown. It drives demand at the back end of those ranges. So if you have a 5-year extension, you're going to see demand for renewable energy more at the back end of that 5 years. I think we recognize that time is of the essence, that we want to kind of address that unintended consequence to make sure there's a good glide path in the early years. And so I think focusing on the details of the CEPP, Clean Energy Standard, it'll be important to address that glide path issue so we can address that demand in the early years. I think there's a lot of creative thinking on how to do that. We've got some ideas. We're happy to share those ideas and make sure that we can, have a nice ramp up on the demand for renewable energy using these mechanisms we're talking about. The second issue, that we're focused on is resiliency. On this point, I think we'd all agree that we want our clean energy to be resilient at the same time. And we really feel strongly that gas is key. It's part of the resiliency equation. So we want to make sure that these programs focus on the proper role of gas. If we look at various Clean Energy Standard proposals, they swing in all different directions, from some foreclosing gas entirely to some treating gas as clean energy. And we're not going to focus on the details today, but we feel strongly that gas should be part of the solution in the near term and the long term. We can show that as you rely more on gas, you can continue to drive emissions down. And if we look at the infrastructure bill, the BIF, that took a long-term view on gas by supporting projects for carbon capture, sequestration, hydrogen, carbon hubs, direct air capture, recognizes the role of gas as being part of the energy equation. We think gas builds a base load for renewable energy, and we look to decarbonize gas turbines long-term through investments in carbon capture, sequestration, hydrogen, and so on, and back those up with investments. So if the CEPP is really about carbon intensity, we think there's a role for gas in there in the short term, as well in the long term as we look to decarbonize those turbines. So we're interested in these issues. We see the appeal in them. I agree with David, the details make the difference. And we want to focus, I think, primarily on these two issues. What's the glide path for renewables, and how do we make sure we're building resiliency at the same time?
Thank you, Roger. And I want to turn to Neil, but before I do, I want to set this up a little bit. One of the key thing, what we're talking about, one of the things is how you design a market to be most efficient, right? To get to the result you want. This is a regulatory approach. Those incentives are going to have an impact on how the market reacts. And it certainly is going to favor the integrated utilities, the larger companies. And there's a debate about whether, the big utilities, vertically integrated utilities, and the large, which usually build, the nuclear plants, the large gas plants, the infrastructure that's going to last 40, 50 years, right? You make an investment, and that investment, you're locked into that, right? Like the coal plants, we're retiring them, but we're retiring them based on when they've reached the end of their life cycle. On the other end of that is a more competitive market model that, encourages a bunch of different companies, smaller companies, a lot of renewable energy companies to build out and meet what the market demand wants. I think one thing that was interesting with Roger is that you're building gas turbines, but you also recognize that one of the solutions to resiliency, or one of the big frontiers for resiliency, is the technology side. How we manage the grid, that's all changing. We can go now both ways. You can demand management. You can reduce demand as well as increase production. So that's an interesting that GE is working on both sides, and I think those are both exciting prospects. Neil, I want to turn to you when we talk about regulation and market design. I know you've been in the middle of all this. Where is FERC and where is Neil Chatterjee?
So I think I want to start by telling a positive story, which is that when you look at how our markets have been working for the past couple of decades, we've seen technological innovation, advancements in the acceleration of deployment of new and cleaner and innovative technologies that have really worked to squeeze carbon out of the power sector in the absence of any kind of heavy-handed regulations or mandates. When you look back and think that the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill was never passed by Congress, the Clean Power Plan was ultimately stayed by the courts, President Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord agreements, and yet power sector emissions in the US continued to decline over that period. And it's primarily due to market forces. There's a real business case to be made for clean energy today, and we're seeing consumers demand it. And when I talk about consumers, it's everyone from individual families to mom and pop small businesses to Fortune 50 companies. As people become more aware of their sources of energy generation, people are demanding cleaner sources of energy, and the power sector is delivering it. And so I want to start off there by looking at the positive story about the successes that we have had in squeezing carbon out while benefiting consumers, the economy, and the environment while maintaining reliability. But it has led to some challenges. As Roger mentioned, most of the energy policy that has been made in the US the last decade and a half has come via the tax code. We really haven't had a significant rewrite of our energy policy in this country since EPACT 05. There have been subsequent smaller pieces of legislation, but there hasn't been that big comprehensive rewrite since EPACT 05. And for a long period of time, most of the policy was made via the tax code, not even in energy bills, but in these omnibus appropriations bills. And in the absence of that kind of federal leadership, what has happened is states have taken it upon themselves to enact policies that benefit their preferred energy course. And in the competitive markets that FERC oversees, that has put us into a position where we've had to make some difficult choices between efficient markets and making sure we have accurate price signals, while also trying to respect the rights of states to make decisions about their own generation mix. There's been a lot of ink spilled and difficult choices around the minimum offer price rule in FERC markets that we oversee. And it's been a real struggle. And it wasn't as if the commission went in trying to pick and choose winners and losers or one preferred source of generation or the other. We were trying to have effective and efficient market signals and try to see how best to strike a balance between the markets we oversee and these state policy decisions. And that's where I came around on this idea of a price on carbon in FERC jurisdictional markets. Obviously, there's some challenges there, but in putting forward the policy statement that the commission did, what we did essentially was lay out a roadmap. We did not say that FERC was going to unilaterally impose a price on carbon. We did not say that FERC was going to collect, any kind of dividend yielded from a price on carbon. We simply laid out a roadmap so that should a state choose to put a price on carbon, and should that be incorporated into an RTO or ISO's tariff, that the commission had the legal authority to evaluate the just and reasonableness of such a proposal. And I actually think that's a step in the right direction. It was attacked on both sides. I think a lot of conservatives view a price on carbon as a carbon tax, and there are real questions about carbon leakage and price leakage that certainly need to be addressed. I think folks who want to see a more aggressive approach towards reducing emissions felt that it was just a baby step. And my response there was, it's okay to take a baby step. We've been talking about this policy for some time now. Let's take the baby step. Let's see if someone comes into the commission with a just and reasonable proposal and see what happens from there. And so that's sort of the state of play at FERC. It will be interesting to see what happens via the legislative process, and if something moves forward and how the commission would move to implement that. Obviously, as has been stated by David and Roger, the devil will be in the details. And this is where it gets tricky. I pull back from my FERC experience to my days in the Senate, working in the leadership where, we had to deal with reconciliation packages and complex rules around reconciliation. And it is very difficult to structure, policy that ought to really go by regular order for reconciliation. And that's where I get a little bit nervous. I'm not going to prejudge the outcome of anything until I see what the legislative text looks like. But I can tell you, as someone who has firsthand experience with this process, it is not an ideal way to construct policy. I personally would like to see Congress take leadership on energy policy and pass legislation that addresses carbon mitigation at the federal level, so that commissions like FERC aren't put into this situation where we're having to play referee between states and markets. But my preference would be for that legislative package to move forward via a regular order process and not through the complex Byzantine reconciliation rules.
Yeah, and I just, and the reason for that for listeners is because to meet the budget reconciliation rules and to qualify with the Byrd rule, not to get more esoterical, there have to be certain, it has to raise money and it has to have certain budgetary things. And so what you do then is you end up, compromising on policy, and like electricity policy is complicated enough without doing it. And I also think, speaking on the Senate and the Congress, we have a tendency to want to go big. But what my old boss in the Senate used to call, lashing rocks together to see if it will float. We like to put everything in, but incrementalism really does work better. A lot of times it is slow. And a lot of people, especially there's been a lot of advocacy around this increasingly. I mean, one of the things, Neil, is in the last decade, we've seen the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen this politicization of FERC. FERC, we used to call FERC's the nerd prom is how we refer to FERC. And, it has become very politicized because of the advocacy and the push on climate policy. So there's definitely a lot of pressure in Congress to get something done and do something big. Let's pull back a little bit and talk about how a CES would affect different energy sources, because it has an effect on price and where, how it impacts the different types of energy sources. And as renewables get cheaper, let gas beat out coal, not because necessarily regulatory policy, but because of market forces, right? Gas got cheap, and that's why we were able, one of the great reasons we were able to move so quickly and reduce emissions is because of this move, in the last 15 years to natural gas generation. So, but that was a market force. So who are the winners and losers on a CES, or what does it do, the impact on electricity prices? I don't know.
Yeah, well, let me just jump in to start with some broad thoughts there, and others can jump in on pricing impacts and things. I think if, as both Roger and Neil said, look, we're just seeing enormous pressure for more clean energy from customers and from investors, and increasingly from regulators and legislators as well, obviously. But if we're going to achieve some of these aggressive goals, it's important both to build new clean generation, but we've got to preserve the existing clean generation. And we're not seeing that under the current system. Right now, nuclear power provides 20% of the electricity in the nation, but is half of our clean energy. And unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen a dozen plants retire before the end of their licensed lives. There are another couple of dozen that are at risk of closing prematurely, including 4 of our units in Illinois that are scheduled to retire later this year, absent some policy action in the Illinois legislature. So right now, not all clean energy sources are treated equally. What we really need is a policy that is both tech neutral and age neutral. And so it's got to apply not only to all clean generation, but to both new and existing resources if we're going to meet some of these ambitious goals. And I think that's one of the benefits of a clean energy standard. Right now, the tax policy is rife with technology preferences. It doesn't reward all clean generation. And so we'll see what happens here. But the clean energy standard, yes, it's a regulatory construct, but it also has a lot of important market elements. Under a CES, you kind of set the targets and the timetables, but then the technologies are able to compete on a technology neutral basis to see who can get to meet that desired outcome.
David, how much does the relicensing and the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission process, play into that? We've looked and it's true that a lot of our existing fleet could be extended their lifespan, but there are other regulatory challenges that, and I don't want to go too far off of a CES discussion, but there are other challenges that Congress needs to deal with. Back to what Neil said, we don't have an energy policy in this country. We've got a patchwork.
Yeah, and on the nuclear side, the regulatory process is much more of a burden for new plants than for existing when it comes to relicensing. I'd really take my hat off to the NRC for their work in considering license renewal applications in a very timely manner. In fact, there's a provision where as long as you file well in advance of the expiration of your license, you can continue to operate beyond the expiration of your license if the commission is still considering your application. So there's kind of a safeguard there. So on the license renewal side, it's not an issue, has not been an issue, but it is certainly a challenge for new plants and certainly for new technologies that the NRC has not previously licensed.
One last question on that, do you see the cultural opposition and the advocacy opposition, the environmental community to nuclear change under a CES or changing? A lot of conservative friends of mine joke, like, look, I'll take climate change seriously when they start building nuclear plants. And so do you see that changing? Because that's an important part of the future here.
Yeah, I do. I think that, look, there will always be naysayers who oppose anything nuclear. But I think in recent years, the real story is that you've seen a growing bipartisan support for nuclear. And, I just point to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse as a prime example. I mean, here's a senator from Rhode Island. They've got no nuclear in their backyard, and yet he's kind of leading the charge on making sure that existing nuclear gets compensated for the clean air attributes that it brings to the table. And he's been very supportive of a process for advanced reactors. I think that advanced reactors are going to have to compete on price with everything else that's out there. And that's the beauty of a CES or any kind of a technology neutral standard is you can put technologies on a level playing field and let them fight it out in the marketplace. So the key for advanced reactors is they're going to have to show that they're price competitive in the long run with renewables and other non-emitting resources. And the key there is, getting a little government assistance up front for the first set of plants to see whether they can be built on time and on budget and really compete in the marketplace.
Robert,
You had your hand up?
yeah, there's a couple things, I think one of the issues, I'm on this, I don't know, there's 450 people in this electric brain trust. And the question the other day was, okay, if we're going to go in this direction, how much solar can you actually integrate into a market, for example, before prices go to zero? Or you saw in Australia, in Southern Australia, Q1 of this year, prices were negative $12 from 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. For Q1, the average across the whole period. And the answer, from some of the folks on EBT, when I said, this is the direction, they said, no, it doesn't have to be. First, transmission, which someone had asked, Scott Siegel had asked about in the questions over on the right. And certainly the FERC's done some great work recently raising that question again, saying, look, we know renewables are further from load centers. We know they are intermittent. We got to think about transmission. And if you talk to the CEOs of some of the largest solar companies, they say, give us transmission lines, same with the wind companies, and we can create a more resilient grid because we can move clean energy from the areas where the fuel is abundant in the Southwest or the spine of the country to the load pockets. So that piece is absolutely critical to getting us to this 80, 100%. It's going to be hard to do it if we have these isolated markets without that ability to move. The second thing is we cannot forget the demand side of the meter. Integration of a lot of these renewable technologies. Batteries alone won't do it. 4 hours of storage, the amount we need to get to 80 or 100%. First of all, you won't get to 100% with 4 hours. You need longer duration stuff. But you're also going to need to have a lot more flexible load. And again, FERC rightly jumped in with Order 2222, said, let's stimulate what's happening in those competitive markets so that the demand side of the meter starts to play in this market much more proactively today. So those two things, transmission and customer side, are sine qua nons for getting to some kind of 80% or 100% goal. That will not happen without those two players.
And Neil, let me switch back to you then and ask you about transmission, because it really is kind of a federal question, right? Because it's crossing state borders, and you've just got some basic NIMBYism, concerns that are hold up transmission. So I know FERC's done some things lately. So when you jump in there.
Yeah, look, I want to applaud Chairman Glick and my colleagues for the ANOPR that FERC passed in July to really begin the process of looking at transmission. But I'm under no illusions that it's going to be easy. Look, I tried to tackle transmission during my tenure as chair. We looked at FERC Order 1000, and everyone was in agreement that almost a decade in to this policy, it's not achieving the goals that it was intended to. But that's where the agreement fell apart. Once you start talking about what to do about Order 1000, what to do about siting, about cost allocation, about interregional planning, you pull on that ball of yarn and it starts to unravel very quickly. So this is a very challenging thing to do. The approach I took, being cognizant of how much bandwidth it would have taken to tackle transmission, was to have sort of targeted solutions, provide clarity around the Commission's ROE process. These are high CapEx investments, and we wanted to inject some regulatory certainty there. We looked at incentives to incentivize the right kinds of transmission investments, and in many ways, by taking steps like we did on FERC Order 2222 and 841, removing barriers to entry within markets for some of these innovative new technologies, we set the framework up and cleared the path to where this iteration of the Commission does have the bandwidth to try and tackle transmission. I think it's going to take a couple of years. It's not going to be an easy process, but I commend the chairman and my colleagues for taking it on. and I wish them well, but it's going to be a challenge.
You know, I was looking at this, you know, Senator Barrasso is now chairman of the Energy Committee. And, you know, it is states like Wyoming that could actually benefit as they transition. You know, it's a coal heavy state. It's, you know, a fossil fuel production state, but those upper plain states are also big opportunities for wind production, and they've got to get that wind to market. And so I just wonder at what point, you know, they recognize the transmission needs to be part of that solution so that they can actually, you know, actually benefit, creating new jobs and not just subsidizing, you know, for the old production that's, you know, it's getting phased out. Because right now you've got a protection, you know, your states or fossil states are fighting to protect what they have. And slowly, the recognition of the opportunity in the future is slow. And transmission is one of the big hurdles there. Roger, you know, that technology answer, can you, you know, help us illuminate some of the things on that demand side and that GE is doing? Because that's an exciting area that is part of the solution. It's not just the energy source, gas or nuclear or renewables that we've been talking about. It's that, how do you manage that grid, and what's the technology that makes it much more flexible and resilient?
Well, thank you. And you know, I would almost go so far to say, some people, you know, may not agree with this, but thinking through the grid side of this is as important as thinking through the renewable energy side. As we think about bringing more renewables online, we have to be thinking about how do we integrate those renewables, make them resilient. And it's not just about renewables too. We're seeing all kinds of increasing threats to the grid, from more severe, longer lasting weather events, from cybersecurity, from basically outdated infrastructure. So there's this huge opportunity to do this all at once: build renewables, make the grid more resilient through technologies. And so, you know, there's a couple examples there. Like as you know, the United States is getting great momentum on offshore wind in the Northeast. We're in the early days, but the momentum is building, and we have to be thinking it's not just about building those turbines offshore. That's really important, but making sure we can integrate that energy into the northeastern grid. When we think about places like Texas, Wyoming, and some of the other places you mentioned, you know, renewables are going to be spread further out. It's more of a two-way street in the way electricity flows. It's more variable. And again, we want to get back to resilience. So there's a number of physical tools to do so. There's some pretty exciting technologies out there, things like HVDCs and other high voltage, you know, DC current, and the way you convert that to help make renewable energy go longer distances. There's ways you can take existing physical tools like substations and digitize them so they become, you know, more electronic, more defensible against threats, all kinds of different threats, and able to be managed in real time, as opposed to people physically kind of pulling switches and things like that. And then there's pure digital solutions, which are getting a real world, real time look at the grid, so you can make sure the electrons are moving in the ways they need to as risks appear and different electricity is coming on and offline. So again, this is the hard stuff. Like, transmission lines are important. We want to string the transmission lines, but we also have to be thinking about the hard parts of the grid, and that's where technology comes in. There's a combination of physical, there's a hybrid of physical and digital, and then there's pure digital to make sure that we have this modern, resilient grid.
And we've also got something of a large versus a small model. So on the consumer side, whether it's, you know, especially on the retail side, which I do a lot of work on, you've got a lot of consumers installing rooftop solar, they're installing their own batteries. You know, that energy production, once they've served their own needs, met their own needs, can be pulled back to the grid too and dispersed. And there's a debate going on also about what is more resilient, these large systems or, you know, smaller microgrids, neighborhood microgrids that can be isolated. You know, one of the success stories during the Texas outage was that consumers who owned their own energy generation were able to interconnect and were able to stay online, right? And if you can connect those with technology into a microgrid and pull energy, you know, demand side management from one place to another, but it's that adds flexibility to the system, but it's a different approach, right? It's a bottom up instead of this top down. So, you know, it's interesting, and I don't know how I know that on the retail side, there's concerns about a clean energy standard and how it would address DERS, dispatchable energy. So the one question here I wanted to ask, proponents of a CES are talking about having different starting points percentage-wise for compliance levels over time for those regulated entities. How would that work, in the consumer choice markets that we're talking about, where customers can move and change suppliers? Is there, are you raising your hand, Neil, or?
No.
Sorry. Is there, I don't know, Peter, if you want to address that, how would these CES standards, setting these standards for production of clean energy, how would that impact consumer markets where, consumers, the nice thing about a consumer market is they can vote with their feet. And that's compared to, if you're in a vertically integrated market, you've got, one utility who provides everything.
Right. So, I might be starting from the wrong point of embarkation, but I think about a place like Massachusetts where I live, where there's an RPS, but there are in many states as well, both in competitive markets and not. So where there's retail supply, there's almost always RPS. So everyone's at a minimum level right now. And then retailers are buying system power, which essentially is that mix. And then some are obviously greening up supply. So at some level, the tide's lifting with those percentages of renewables and affecting everybody differently. I suppose if someone's ahead of that curve, they're proclaiming that and they're charging perhaps a premium accordingly based upon what their percentage of renewables are. But again, how that gets enacted and what the impacts are going to be on price at a local level, I think that still remains a little bit to be seen.
How does, I think one thing is, how do you see a federal clean energy standard interacting with all the states? 30 states plus DC have their own either clean energy standard or renewable portfolio standard. So they're already requiring or incentivizing a certain mix of clean energy at the state level. How does that, what's your opinion on how a federal standard should interact with that?
Well, almost all the state levels are targeting less than that. I mean, even New York, which is pretty aggressive, 70%, and then, I think it's 100% by sort of the similar date. But almost everybody else is at less than what the federal standard is looking at. Even a place like Hawaii, California, they're 100% by 2045. So this essentially pushes that frontier closer to today. So essentially, I think everybody gets sort of bundled in and rolled over, if you will, by these more stringent standards.
David, Roger, any thought on that? I've talked to retail advocates who think that the federal standard should be a floor, not a ceiling. And I think, what's the danger of some more progressive states increasing their state standard to exceed the federal standard? Are you going to have an arms race there? I'm not really sure how that gets played out.
I guess, my understanding of the CEPP, to get a little more specific from just the clean energy standards, I think this raises good philosophical questions for a clean energy standard. My understanding of the CEPP, which, someone can correct me because I won't claim to be the expert in it like some others, is it's really an incentivized system. So I think what they're doing is they're putting federal incentives on top of existing systems. It's not necessarily mandating anything. So I don't think it would preempt anything at the state level. And I guess if a state wanted to offer, raise the bar, I guess they would look at that. But I imagine that's how the thinkers of this, the designers of CEPP are reconciling this, making it kind of like an optional carrot system as opposed to any type of stick, which I think theoretically would preserve that space for the states to do their own systems as well without a lot of inconsistency.
Well, and then I guess it brings us back to our initial conversation on the state of play in Congress, where you had a initial clean energy standard introduced, but because of the process that the Congress is in right now and looking to pass something under budget reconciliation, they have gone more to the CEPP model, which is again different. There's been talk of a stick proponent being included. We ought to say none of us really know the details because they have not been unveiled. And I know that's a little frustrating to everybody who's, watching this, especially the industries, but everybody involved is, what are the details? But there's been talk of adding the stick, and whether that's going to survive or not. I think we're all watching Senator Manchin on that point. He's got a key position. He's at a unique place as a Democrat on the Energy Committee with from a fossil state. So I don't know if Neil, do you have any insight you can share on how we're proceeding here in Congress?
I don't. My apologies. I used to be at the epicenter of these conversations, but with all the work we've been doing at FERC, I haven't had the bandwidth to dig into the details.
And what is FERC's under the CEPP or clean energy standard? Where do you see FERC going? What's going to be the impact on the regulatory agency?
Again, we'll have to see what the language does, what implementation looks like, without having some idea of how it will be structured, what the incentives will be, whether there'll be a stick or not, and how it interplays with the existing tariffs that FERC oversees. That's all to be determined.
So we really should have subtitled this webinar, "The Devil's in the Details." David, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think one of the flip sides to the question that got asked earlier about starting points is, in competitive markets, how do you determine what the starting point for a deregulated utility is? So for example, if you're a utility buying from PJM, yes, you're getting maybe 35% of your energy from clean sources, but you have no contractual entitlement to the clean energy component of that. You're just buying electricity, energy. And so do you say, well, you're in Illinois and Illinois is 60% clean, so 60% is your starting point? Or do you say, well, you're in PJM, so your starting point is 30 or 35? But in that first year as a utility, you're going to have to go out and not just procure the 3% extra or the 5% extra. You're going to have to go out and procure that full 35 or 40% in year one, because unless you've got a bilateral contract with somebody, you're not entitled to the clean energy credit that's associated with that energy. So that's going to be another really dicey question as we go forward. And that may provide a new role for PJM and thus FERC when you start talking about how to kind of manage clean air attributes associated with wholesale markets.
Who receives the credit, right? Whether it's the producer or the utility that sells it to the consumer.
Yeah, well, the obligation is on the retail electricity supplier, right? And so they'll have to purchase it from somebody, whether it's purchasing it as part of the electricity that they're buying or as a separate credit.
Right. Roger, we've got about 7 minutes left. I just want to go around and any last thoughts, any points you want to make?
Well, one thing I appreciate about the timing of this conversation is I think it reflects a broader theme that we're seeing this process kick off, I think, with reconciliation and potentially the CEPP, which was in the Senate's budget proposal last week. I think it's, we're encouraged to see a fair amount of outreach and soliciting of views as this is being drafted. I think that's the right way to go. And so for those who are listening or participating in this process, just to encourage the open type of discussion with people like David and Peter and us and others, because I think what you have in this dynamic as we sit here in the, coming up on the fall of 2021 are a lot of like-mindedness on wanting to reach similar goals. There may be some views on how to get there with the details, but that's all very constructive because I think it's important to hear a diversity of views. You know, we come from this from the perspective of a technology provider. David comes from this as a perspective of a utility. And I think, you know, if we're aligned on roughly the same goals, and or at least we're trying to see success in these outcomes, the opportunity to make sure that you're involving broad stakeholder input, you're listening to these ideas, doesn't mean everybody's gonna agree with every idea, but everybody's being heard. I think that'll facilitate the success of both, you know, a program that's gonna have the permanence and the certainty and the implementation that it's warranted. I think what we've seen in climate change policy over the last few decades is there's been a lot of ideas, but we haven't been able to get something to stick that's been really impactful. I think there's a sense that time is of the essence, and there's an urgency to this. And so I just want to, you know, say that I'm feeling optimistic about the early outreach efforts I've seen, and I hope that continues, because I think it'll be in everyone's best interest to have a diversity of views at the table in these discussions.
Well, and thank you for that. You know, I think it's important to pull the climate urgency out of this discussion, and remember that what we're talking about is the, you know, the power system for our nation that drives everything, and that ultimately consumers pay for. And so in a very innovative and rapidly changing sector. And so making sure that it is resilient, you know, as I know, you know, you guys are very concerned about, but also very, you know, the ability to innovate, the ability to respond to consumer demand, both large and small. You know, the affordability is hugely important, not only for consumers, small consumers who care what their electricity bill is going to be, but also for manufacturing and for every business in the country, right? This is long-lasting policy that will have a major impact on our competitiveness as a country. So, you know, doing whatever it takes under the rubric of climate change, we don't want to make mistakes that are going to impact how competitive we are, how much innovation we can drive, as well as, you know, the affordability of the energy we need. There are parts of the country, you know, both my home state of Alaska, but also in Maine and New England, that are using, you know, still use diesel for heating. And that's, you know, especially in the lower 48, a distortion of our US energy policy based on how we move energy from between state to state. So getting this right is going to have long-term impacts. And, you know, I think it's an important discussion. And so I really appreciate everybody being here. Any last minute comments, David, on that?
Well, I'll just say, you know, again, a clean energy standard does have a regulatory construct in terms of setting a target and timetable, but then it really does let the market work. And I think that that's all that we're looking for from a clean energy perspective. It's important to let these existing sources compete. And there really is a sense of urgency here as well. I mean, with the looming closure of additional nuclear plants, we're at risk of going backwards, not forwards. And that just makes life tougher and more expensive for everybody.
Peter, I'm going to give Neil the last word here.
Sure. Is it doable? Yes. Is it going to be easy? No. Getting even to 80% means lots more renewables, nukes, a lot of storage, 4 hour, 6 hour, ultimately getting to 100%. You're going to need hydrogen and other long duration capabilities to completely decarbonize the economy. Over 15 years, it's doable. We got to get started right away.
Neil, can we design a market that makes everyone happy and does all of these things?
We haven't yet.
We haven't yet, but look, we're always making iterative changes to the markets, right? The markets today don't look like what they did, you know, a decade ago. And as new technologies have come online, and as you know, things like FERC Order 2222 and 841, you know, are further implemented, we're going to see more market changes. But I want to zero in on a core point that Roger made, which is that we need some permanence in this policy and stability. And that is what makes me very nervous about the manner in which the CEPP is being discussed. Not only does it have to be drafted in a way that it survives a birdbath under reconciliation instructions, it's also a matter of the votes. Not a single Republican is going to vote for this. So you're going to need all 50 Democrats to sign off on this approach. You can't afford to lose a single one. And then if it does go through and power in Congress and the White House shifts in a few years, and if it's reversed, that's not helpful either. I think one of the things that I have come to learn and appreciate during my time at FERC is that FERC is kind of a beacon of stability in what has been an otherwise volatile energy landscape. If you look, for instance, at EPA under the Obama administration went one direction, went a totally different direction under the Trump administration, and now is whipsawing back in the other direction. And it's very difficult to make long-term investment decisions when you're having to peg it to the political pendulum swinging back and forth. That's why I like a more, a bipartisan, consensus-based, stakeholder-based approach that has permanence. And I have some agita about what is appearing to be a partisan process to get this done in terms of its long-term stability.
That's a great summary at the end here. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges is we keep whipsawing back and forth on policy. I want to thank everyone on the panel. This has been a great discussion. I also want to thank the audience. We've had some great participation in the chat here from some very knowledgeable DC energy experts. And, I acknowledge that we haven't covered every corner of this policy and some of the intricacies in depth. And so, I know other groups are talking about this, and we may revisit this again when we know what Congress is going to do when they unveil it. But I thank everyone and stay engaged, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you very much.